Hey, deserving listeners. Today's episode is Chapter 2 in my deep dive on dependent personality disorder. This episode is just for patrons of the podcast, but I'm going to have a short intro here. So in Chapter 1, I went over a full description of dependent personality disorder. In this episode, I'm going to go over the causes as I see them and according to the research of dependent personality disorder and dependency in general. This is perhaps the most important chapter because I think when you understand the causes, everything else makes sense. But first, I thought I would give my second case presentation or fictional composite of someone with dependent personality disorder. In Chapter 1, I went over Aiden, and this time I'm going to talk about a fictional person named Michelle. And these are completely fictionalized, just completely made up from a composite of literally dozens of people. So let's get to it. So Michelle. So she was born into a family, and she's the last of 4 children. As a young child, she was very easygoing, and she was much easier than the other kids, although she was anxious often. She was anxious of strangers. And her parents appreciated how easy she was, but they were mildly concerned about her fears of strangers. As a child, her parents fought a lot. Eventually, her parents got a divorce, and she witnessed a lot of the fighting, as all the children did. And it was protracted over a number of years. Her older sister, Michelle's older sister, was parentified and took care of Michelle. Her sister was rewarded for taking care of Michelle. Her big sister resented that responsibility, but also kind of liked that responsibility. But due to her resentment, she took out her anger on Michelle. She was parentified and taking care of Michelle, but she also was very harsh with Michelle as a younger sister. Michelle appreciated the attention from the big sister, but also often felt humiliated and small and incompetent. As she entered school, Michelle did fine. Her teachers liked her. She got along well with everyone. But sometimes bullies took advantage of her because she was quite passive and nice to people. She would be internally afraid of things, but she would never talk about it. As she grew up, her parents noticed that she would sometimes talk like a baby, even though she was 7, 8, 9 years old. And she would play with younger kids. She would also play games made for younger children. The parents tried to get her to stop, and they would discipline her, but the behavior never really went away. Eventually, the family just got used to it, and they said, well, that's Michelle. The family saw Michelle as generally incompetent. Michelle was always, quote unquote, screwing something up. When something was broken in the house, they assumed Michelle had done it. And again, they would say, well, that's Michelle. Michelle also saw herself as incompetent. She had low self-esteem, and she felt like an outcast in the family. She was considered stubborn by people around her, particularly her family and her mother. When asked to grow up and act her age, she would refuse. Eventually, that became another assumption about her personality. They'd say, well, that's Michelle. She's the stubborn one. When she wanted something, she asked and asked and asked and asked for it. It usually was something self-indulgent and childish, like candy or a toy made for younger children. She would ask and ask and ask and ask until she got it. She would sneak into the pantry to eat treats and candy. Eventually, the parents would monitor everything she ate and put locks on the pantry. She would escape her stress as a child and a tween by fantasizing about being a princess. She would write stories about being a powerful superhero one day. She often daydreamed about these things to escape, and her mother would catch her daydreaming instead of doing her homework or her chores, and her mom would chastise her. As a teen, she would self-sabotage. For example, she would lose her homework. She would sleep in and miss the bus to school. She would pretend to be sick, so she would miss a test. She would forget to study for a test. She would drive her mother nuts with this self-sabotaging. Her mother would never understood, why does she always screw up? Every day, she's constantly screwing up something. And her mother learned that she had to constantly monitor her and badger her to get her stuff done. Her mother thought maybe she had ADHD or something, so she took her to the doctor, but they didn't find anything different about her. And just a little trigger warning here. You might want to skip forward a few minutes if you are triggered by some descriptions of assault. At her first high school party, she got really, really drunk very fast, and she was sexually assaulted. This was, of course, highly traumatic for her. She didn't want to tell anyone, but she eventually did tell her mother because she told her mother everything. The mother felt bad for Michelle, naturally, and cried for a week. The mother made a resolution that Michelle was not able to take care of herself and that it was up to her to protect her daughter from the world because she knew Michelle would either screw it up or be harmed by someone or taken advantage of. Michelle found she was good at playing video games as a tween and a teenager, and she was good at getting groups of people to play cooperatively with her online. This was the one thing she felt competent at, so she played with others online whenever her mother would let her, which became more and more frequent. In late high school, she met a guy online. He was much older. She knew her mother wouldn't approve of this older man, so she secretly met up with him in private. Her mother found out very easily because the mother monitored her and also had access to all her passwords and whatnot, and grounded her for a month. Again, the family saw this as, well, Michelle, she's the biggest problem in our family. At 18, she met another guy online. He was older as well. She secretly dated him too. She liked how, quote unquote, strong he was. She soon discovered she was pregnant. She didn't tell anyone, including the father, and she acted like her pregnancy did not exist. After 6 months, she broke down and told her mother that she was pregnant. The mother had already suspected that she was pregnant because she monitors her all the time, but she was waiting for Michelle to admit it. The whole family completely flipped out. It was just another reason to see Michelle as the screw-up, Michelle, and they all chastised her and made her feel small. Michelle didn't know what to do, and she avoided talking about it, and she avoided thinking about it. She just wanted it all to go away, but it, of course, didn't go away. She had the baby. She thought she could be a single mother, and she had all these fantasies about being a wonderful mother, but she didn't know how much work it would be. Meanwhile, Michelle's mother knew she would be the primary parent of the child, since Michelle is always the screw-up, and the mother always has to step in for Michelle. And as the child grew up and became a 1-year-old, a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, Michelle really became more like a sister to her own daughter than a mother. So the mother of Michelle's mother, became the mother of both Michelle and the grandchild. And Michelle made a number of other impulsive and self-destructive decisions. Her mother would get really frustrated and angry with her. The father would occasionally get involved and also get angry, but he would mostly avoid because he didn't like the way it felt to get angry at his daughter, and he also didn't like the dynamic between Michelle and the mother because they would fight all the time. And they would also leave him out of things. Michelle sometimes thought about suicide. She thought her infant daughter might be better off without her. She didn't think her life was worth anything. As a 20-something, Michelle was dependent on the parents to pay for occasional bills and this sort of thing. Michelle continued to play video games often with others online. She loved her baby, but she didn't give her enough attention. Her family saw her as impulsive, immature, childlike, irresponsible, stubborn. When confronted, Michelle would regress. She acted like a young child. She would whine. She would not take responsibility. She would blame others. As a 30-something, she struggled with her teen daughter. Michelle had a number of difficult relationships with men that were quote-unquote high drama. Some men were terribly abusive to her, and she had a hard time leaving them, even though everyone told her that she needed to leave these abusive men. She worked on and off at low-wage jobs. Michelle's mother continued to help with the bills, as did the father. But the mother helped with all sorts of things, cleaning the house, parenting the grandchild, this kind of stuff. When Michelle was struggling, she would call her mother almost immediately. But at the same time, she hated her mother's advice. It was the same cycle over and over again. Michelle would screw something up, quote unquote. She would go into denial about it. Eventually, the problem got out of control, so she would feel like she didn't know what to do. She would call her mom, but she was afraid of the advice. Her mom would try to resist getting involved, but things would get so out of control that the mom would step in and would try to fix it. There would be a lot of fighting between Michelle and the mom. The mom would try to convince Michelle to grow up. Michelle would feel small and helpless and incompetent. They would both cry and make up. Things would return to normal, and the cycle would start all over with Michelle screwing something up again, going into denial, eventually calling the mom. The mom would resist. The mom would eventually fix the problem, get involved. Michelle felt helpless and incompetent. They would cry and make up. Things would return to normal. Michelle would screw something up, and on and on and on. Okay. So that is my description of the fictional composite individual of Michelle. This is a composite of many, many people that I've treated over the years, both adolescents and adults, by the way. And what we see here are four different, in the last episode, I talked about Milan's 5 subtypes, and I added a 6th one and I modified it. So we actually have 4 of the 6 subtypes represented in Michelle. Let's go through those. The first one is the childlike dependent. So Michelle exhibited childlike behaviors, immature behaviors. She came across as inexperienced. She saw herself and exhibited that she was incapable of assuming adult responsibilities. And Michelle acted younger than her age since she was very young. The second type that she exhibited, maybe not as much as the others, but a little bit, was the life avoidant dependent, which is what I'm calling it. This is a person that essentially seeks a very limited and easy life. They are generally unproductive. They exhibit and see themselves as being very incompetent. They will refuse to deal with anything that could cause difficulty for them, and they tend to be in denial of their shortcomings. She's also, Michelle, exhibiting the enmeshed dependent in that she merged with her mother and she was willing to give up her identity and become an extension, essentially, of her mother. And then the fourth type is the passive-aggressive dependent, which is a dependent person who is generally nice and easygoing, but underneath all that is suppressed anger that will be expressed through hidden ways, which can be expressed through stubbornness. It's actually one of the red flags of dependency is this annoying stubbornness that people will. The way I've seen it presented is similar to Michelle, but the way I've seen it presented clinically is that these people will be nice and yet stubborn, which is confusing to other people. Other people will not necessarily label them as stubborn because dependent people tend to be very accommodating and nice and pleasing. But at the same time, when it comes to adjusting to other people, they just won't do it because they have a vast sea of emotion, of anger that they have never been allowed to express because of the way that they were treated and the way that they saw themselves. And so one of the only ways they can really assert themselves is to basically act like a terrible two. That's what children, me and the pod wife were just walking the dogs, and there was a fella who was taking his toddler out, his young child out for a stroll in the stroller. And the daughter was in a bad mood, and the dad was trying to cheer her up and, hey, why are you having a meltdown? Hey, everything's fine. And a plane, a jetliner was flying overhead, and the girl saw the plane, and you could tell normally that they might celebrate the fact that they saw the plane. But this child, and I'm guessing the child is around, 3 years old, and they see the plane, and the child says, I don't something about the plane. And then the dad says, well, what do you mean? What about the plane? And the child says, that plane, I don't want it. I don't want the plane. And, because you just know the history, which is common to a lot of young kids, that when you see a plane or a bus or a fire truck or something, there's this big celebration, or a garbage truck even. It's like, yay, here comes the garbage truck. And you just know that the dad and the daughter have had a lot of moments like that. But now that she's having a meltdown, or she's in a bad mood and she needs a nap, she sees the plane and she just doesn't want it. It's, I don't want it. And when kids are like that, it's cute, but when you retain that pattern and that immaturity into adulthood, it can be extremely frustrating to people around you, right? Because just because you're in a bad mood, you're just going to stubbornly resist the most normal of things that other people are asking you to do. And so that's also that passive aggressiveness. And again, it's not because they're jerk faces, it's because they have a vast sea of unexpressed anger that they've never been allowed to express because of the way they were treated growing up. Okay, so that is my case example, fictional, of the case Michelle. And that is another, shall we say, type or presentation, a common presentation of dependent personality disorder. In the last chapter, I talked about Aiden. In future chapters, I'll talk about other presentations. So before I go into the causes, the etiology, again, which I find to be the most important chapter, because once you understand where it comes from, I think you understand all the behaviors thereof, I'm going to introduce the podcast. This is the Psychology in Seattle podcast, and I'm your host, Dr. Kirk. I'm a therapist and a professor. This episode, if you're not a patron, this episode is going to end before the content begins. If you want to hear the full episode, you have to become a patron of the podcast by going to patreon.com. When you become a patron, you get access to this episode along with hundreds of other episodes that are our best episodes, and they're only available to patrons. So if you want to hear this full episode, go to patreon.com, become a patron of the podcast. Do it today if you want. And take care of yourself because you deserve it. You really, really do.